Hey folks, today I would like to talk to you about a spicy video topic. I'm going to talk about veganism and how I feel about veganism with some touch points on slavery, which is something I care very much about. Um, One of the, you know, probably the most fundamental evil of all humankind, slavery, and subjugation of other people and animals, and how that all ties together. Because ultimately, I'm probably not vegan. And veganism, capital V veganism, has sort of changed its definition over time. It's been, and I think that this probably reflects something that's going on in society in general, where definitions for a lot of things are getting a little bit looser. I think we're dealing with, we're sort of diving into a generation and a new cultural zeitgeist of people sort of redefining things for themselves. This is sort of like the proliferation of knowledge and tools and accessibility of technology has sort of, I think, led to a cultural zeitgeist of like personalized truths. I think that's how I would say it. So the example of that would be, once upon a time you can go to Google and search for a fact. And if you search for someone on Google, right, everybody in theory gets the same results. Whereas if you search for somebody in Facebook, you get different results based on who you are, right? It's personalized, the search engine. It will return certain hits before other hits based on what friends you have, what's closer to your social circle. And Google, to some extent, I think is leaning into that as well, where now you're going to get the first results are going to be more reflective of like your personalized shopping experiences in the form of ads and stuff like that. And I think we're coming to an age where the more and more that we refer to truth, it's a personalized truth rather than an objective truth. And it varies, right? And it's a scary place to be as a man of science because everything is context dependent in a way that the real world, maybe not the social world, but like the real physical world is not. I think there are fundamental truths to this universe, certain scientific formulae that are sort of like true no matter where they are, right? And that's sort of what the basis of science is it's sort of a belief that if this physics formula works on this planet, that on another planet, in a world, in a universe, in a galaxy far, far away, it's also going to work as well. But I think, at least socially, that's become less and less true. And what we define as like a social truth is being more and more context dependent, right? And so it's an interesting time to be alive. And I think in these times, to the degree that we can, we should sort of try to hold on to definitions, which is in a sense gatekeeping. Somebody who holds an objective truth is a gatekeeper in a sense, and gatekeeper is obviously a derogatory term. It means to say, hey, man, if I say 3 plus 3 is 7, then who are you to tell me it's 6, right? Fuck you, right? This is my truth. And I think in many realms that's right. It's right for everyone to kind of say what is the right thing for themselves, right? But I think in certain fields, um, and in certain cases, maybe that's not okay. And I think in a case where that's not okay is in in certain circumstances of moral unjust actions, right? In things like slavery. I think in slavery, I think slavery is objectively bad. And I think most people would agree with that. But I think the there's a bit of entrenchment uh, psychologically that happens when you grow up around slavery that sort of affects your worldview, and that's sort of to be expected, right? So, for example, in slavery, I'm going to talk about maybe let's talk about American slavery, okay, specifically American chattel slavery. Um, this is the slavery that is most commonly talked about. It's the kind of slavery where black people, primarily black people, right, from Africa and the transatlantic slave trade would be subjugated to work, primarily doing manual labor, right? Like picking cotton is a pretty common example. And so these folks who would pick cotton, obviously, were very much abused and horrible things happened to them. But there was certainly a zeitgeist that was present during the time of slavery and certainly in antebellum period where people would say, hey, you know what? Um, we treat our slaves really well. And we treat them so well that they actually are cared for even better in our dominion than they would if they were living on their own, right? And of course they'd say some really racist things, right? In their maybe a savage home country, right? So this is something that was a very common sentiment, certainly in an antebellum post-war South United States, right? And it's obviously not true, right? That's obviously ridiculous. But but I don't think it's absolutely untrue. Because the truth is that, people would say something like this. They'd say, hey, we own our slaves. So of course we're not going to beat our slaves till they die because they're our property and we're going to treat our property well. And they didn't treat their property well. That's the truth. But they treated their property a lot better than slaves that were owned, rather than slaves that were controlled but not owned by the person they were being controlled by. And the classic example is, of course, the American prison system. So after slavery was outlawed, partially, I guess we should say partially, right? The Constitution was amended to ban slavery in all cases except as a form of punishment. And that law remains today, right? So is slavery illegal in the United States? Somewhat, right? Slavery in the year of 2022 is illegal unless as a form of punishment. So, all right, like any prison justice reform scholar will tell you, slavery is still very much alive in the United States. Anyone who has committed a crime can be forced by the government to do labor, and that labor does not need to be paid. And in many cases in the United States, it is paid, but at a rate that is, it's fucked, right? It's like $1 an hour, or in many cases lower than $1 an hour, perhaps. So that's slavery. It's still alive. It's still here in America, and there was a series of black codes that were enacted after slavery was illegalized. And what those black codes did was they allowed disproportionately black people, right? They're called black codes because they were really, designed for the black people to get arrested and to go to jail so that they could be subjugated in a format that was now legal with the new definition. And what, was plain to see is the death rate was alarmingly high for these black people who were owned by now the state, right? Because the state didn't treat the slaves as well as the individual owners did. And so, when I said there was a bit of a truth to that statement that in the antebellum South, where they're like, hey, we treated the slaves better than we could have. I don't think we could have really fathomed how poorly the slaves could have been treated, right? But once they were owned by the state, and the state didn't really have to worry about all these people under their dominion literally dying from the work that they were putting them through, suddenly these people just started, dying like crazy, right? The death rate was just ridiculous because we've realized really how little, how little, people could care for each other. It was, it's really fucking sad, right? And and that continues today, right? There's still, that's still the law, right? You could still have a slave as long as they're just as a form of punishment. And so, why is this important? And why is it relevant to veganism? That's it sounds like a crazy tangent, but I think there's a lot of parallels there, because I mean, the truth is that when people see humans being abused, they are a lot more sensitive to that than when they see animals being abused. And even within the animal kingdom, I mean, there's certain, this is called speciesism, where if you see, a man get shot, you think, oh, that's fucked, right? And then if you see a dog get shot, then you think, oh, that's really bad, right? Maybe not as bad as killing a human, but killing a dog's pretty bad. And then you're like killing a cow or killing a bird or killing a deer, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's bad, but it's not as bad as the dog, but it's not as bad as the human, right? So it's sort of like this chain that somehow equates a life to, its value of really its worth based on what species it is, right? So that's sort of a present there, and I think that's why examples of dog abuse are so relevant when we talk about veganism, because the truth is, if people saw what happened to the animals today in the modern dairy and meat industry, if they saw that happen to their own pets, then they'd go bonkers, right? They'd be like, what the heck are you doing to my dog, right? That's crazy, more so than, but not as much still as if they saw it happen to their own son. Then they'd be like, oh my God, you can't put my son in a cage, right? This is ridiculous, right? So I think that sort of inequality is at the root of sort of understanding the injustice of the modern meat and dairy industry. So let me tie those connections a little bit more together, because all this feeds into sort of why I'm not vegan. Um, the vegan stance is paralleled in some way by an abolitionist stance, right? An abolitionist is someone who's against slavery, and an abolitionist it's an absolutist stance. It's saying slavery is not okay. And in particular, abolitionists believe that there is no balance of power that is just in practice between a slave owner and an enslaved person. Which is to say that, no matter how the contract is written, if somebody is owned by another person, that relationship is inherently unjust, right? So, have there been cases of slavery that was a just trade between someone's labor and a compensation, probably financial? The answer is probably yes. There was probably many examples of slavery that was okay, as crazy as that sounds. I mean, it probably doesn't sound that crazy if you're an American, because in your own country, it's legal, right? In certain cases where people, it's a form of punishment. So in those cases, you might say, okay, yeah, I guess it's legal, so maybe it's not so bad, right? But I think that case is probably not a good example, because I think the American prison system is unjust. I think that's not okay. But I think there's other cases of slavery. Particularly, I can think of, there were some cases of indentured servitude. The first slaves in America were white, right? The first slaves in America from the Europe, well, the first slaves in America were Native Americans, right? This was a common practice for Native American tribes to enslave each other, right? But the first, let's say, European slaves in America were people who were poor and they couldn't afford to pay for travel to the United States. So they said, hey, I will, in exchange for a free ride, I'll work your lands, right? And these were, in many cases, skilled farm laborers, to the degree that a farm laborer, of that time, could be considered a skilled worker. And what these people would do is they would work off the cost of their transfer in labor. And I'm sure we could find examples from history where there was a just relationship there. In particular, I think, that's an American example, and I'm an American, so I can lean on that example a little bit more. But I think there's other cultures within our side of the world that are probably even more emblematic of sort of a more just transfer of goods, in particular of labor goods. And that would be probably the encomienda system in Southern America and in Central America, where I think due to the seasonality of the crop harvest, there was a more regular transfer of ownership between an enslaved person's status. And I think that helped to reduce what would otherwise be like a strong social caste between persons who are enslaved and people who are slavers, right? So I think in some cases we could look at better examples, but within America, I think the indentured servitude case is probably the case of like the closest slavery has ever been adjust. But an abolitionist would say, hey, you know what? Maybe there's a case here and there. But fundamentally, theoretically, or sorry, but fundamentally, even if in theory, if there's some cases that are just, in practice, on the whole, slavery is unjust. And I think that's true. I think slavery is, as I said before, I think it's the darkest evil that mankind has ever committed and continues to commit, right? Slavery is not okay, really, in any circumstance. And the case is that in practice, even if, it's like a nice transfer of goods and services, the power imbalance in that relationship has, in so many cases, right, led to unjust circumstance, right? So we've all heard of maybe the coal miners who are paid for their work, but at the same time, they have to pay the same company that's employing them for their lodging and their tools and their workman's gear in such a way that they never pay off the expenses that they've accrued, right? And so they're trapped, right? Then what was originally indentured servitude becomes slavery in every definition of the term, right? It's entrapment through financial control, right? And so I think a lot of these situations evolve from what may have been perceived as a just circumstance of labor in exchange for compensation. And so that's why an abolitionist will say, hey, slavery is absolutely evil. And it's an absolutist stance, which goes back to what we were saying before about this sort of like fundamental truth. They're saying fundamentally slavery's bad. Now, a vegan is somebody who says, hey, controlling animals is fundamentally bad, right? Sure, there's some circumstances that you might treat an animal fairly or justly, let's say, but on the whole, the relationship between a pet and its owner is like an unfair relationship. There's a power imbalance there that is so great that it's insurmountable. Similar to how there's a power imbalance between a slave and a slaver. That's an insurmountable power balance. Yeah, maybe there were some examples of a slave that earned his freedom and somehow it was a just circumstance, you might say, maybe in some situations. But on the whole, right, an abolitionist will collectively agree that's not okay. And a vegan, on the whole, will agree, hey, controlling an animal is not okay, right? Which is why having pets is not vegan, right? It's this belief that, sure, you might say a pet is a member of your family, but when it comes down to it, on the whole, people are not going to treat their pets as well as they would have, their sons and their daughters and their brothers and their sisters and their husbands and their wives, right? It's this idea that power imbalance from a species standpoint and from what is essentially an owner, right? People don't call, what do you call the somebody who has a pet, right? You call them the owner of the pet, right? It's like you'd call a master of a slave, right? It's owner, right? So I think that's sort of the issue that the vegans believe in, right? They believe you can't have pets, right? And that's not something that I believe, right? I believe that I believe that the power imbalance is not insurmountable. I believe that the legal systems are in such a way, obviously speciesist, right? In modern day America. But I think that's changing a little bit. And I think there's laws for animal abuse today that never existed 100 years ago, right? That would have been maybe unheard of even 100 years ago, right? But I think that the power imbalance is probably, I think it is surmountable. And sure, again, we could point to case studies. I'm sure everybody knows someone who loves their pet so dearly they treat it like a family member. And I'm sure there's people who would sacrifice their life savings before they'd see their pet perish, right? Due to some sort of health emergency, right? But vegans believe that that relationship is always going to be insurmountable, and I believe that it is surmountable. I believe that, you know what, actually, it's different than the slavery case. I think that people can love their pets and care for their pets in a way that is almost like their own child. And I think that's different, right? And so that's a really controversial point, and it's one of the big questions in veganism is whether or not that's okay. And there's a lot of side arguments there. Some people will say things. I mean, this is a little. I don't really enjoy this argument because I think it's a little bit foolish. But some people will say things like, "Hey, man, vegans got to be okay with pets because if I become vegan, what am I going to do with my pets? And if the world became vegan, what would happen to all the pets that are currently pets, right?" And I mean, of course, we've heard this rhetoric of before because every slave owner had said the same thing. They said, "Hey, man, what's going to happen to all the slaves if we set the slaves free? They're going to die, right? Because the slaves couldn't survive on their own. They were uneducated. Most slaves didn't know how to write. Most slaves were not really didn't receive any education. Certainly not formal education, even for what education meant in those days, right? And in many ways, those people were sort of right? Like, oh shit, if you just set all the slaves free, really bad things might happen to them, right? But they were certainly wrong in saying that we shouldn't let them free. It's just that setting the slaves free it was a very gradual process, right? And was there inequality along the way? Absolutely, right? And so how long did it take until the slaves reached equality with the freed man? Well, I just Googled it. Apparently, the last person who was a slave in America, um, if we don't count prison, which is obviously a form of slavery, um, not all prisons a form of slavery. I mean, specifically people who are enslaved under the prison system. Um, okay, so if the last like chattel slave, that person died 50 years ago. So that's pretty recent, right? That's less than a that's less than a lifetime away. And if we count people who are enslaved as a form of punishment, well, then that's still happening today. So obviously, it hasn't ended. And when you look at the history of how how chattel slavery led to these black codes, led to the slavery system under the American judicial system and the penal system, and how that's led today. I mean, uh, I think people are pretty familiar with economic inequality, and if the last slaves only died 50 years ago, it's kind of like, oh shit, we still haven't really righted the scale there, right? So how long did it take? Well, the court is out on that decision, right? It's to say it's not fair yet. We still haven't reached a just system. So, how long would it take for animals to be treated justly? Who's to say, right? I mean, animals have been subjugated and enslaved in various ways since, the first relationship of animals itself, right? So it would take maybe a really fucking long time. But that's not to say it shouldn't happen, right? Because black people in America and people who came from indigenous communities that were enslaved, maybe from the very start of those communities, just because they're still oppressed doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for their equality, right? And just because it's going to be a long road doesn't mean we shouldn't start walking down that road. So that's why that's sort of a silly argument, and it's probably not worth more time than that to explore. But when it comes to veganism, I think that's one of the main things, right? And it's not something that's maybe talked about when you're trying to get someone to become vegan, because I mean, actually, oftentimes one of the first ways to talk about someone about veganism is to say, oh, look at these horrible things that people are doing to animals. And people will say like, oh, if somebody did that to my own pet, if they did that to my dog, I'd be enraged, right? I'd say that's not okay. I'd want to fight to protect my dog. When in reality, the veganist stance is basically saying, okay, yeah, sure, but you can't have your dog either, man. That's also not okay. And I don't really believe that. I think there is I think it's surmountable. I think where the difference lies though is when we move from having, you know, somebody who's a pet. Let's say you're having a dog that's a pet for just your family, and now suddenly you're making a business out of it, and suddenly you have not just a dog, but you've got a farm and you've got a lot of animals that are being subjugated, and you're profiting off of them. And then suddenly I think other incentives, mainly economic incentives, over overweight the scale, and suddenly the the humanity, you might say, is lost in this situation, and suddenly it's, as people say, it becomes a business, right? Sometimes when somebody does something that's really shitty to you, they say it's just business, and I think Americans understand that very well. It's sort of this idea that, to some degree, when economic incentives align, people do evil things. That's just kind of how it goes, right? And that's because, well, I mean, that's because of a lot of things. I think that's just maybe like a fundamental, like maybe human evil or something like that. I'm not sure. But what does that look like in an example? Well, I think maybe like household chickens is a good example. Because while many people will pay for insurance for their pet, or would pay to get a surgery for their pet dog, right? A lot of people aren't going to pay to get a surgery for their pet chicken, right? It's a very different situation there. And so as we sort of, it's a speciesist approach for sure, but or similarly, if you have a lot of dogs, maybe you have a puppy mill, right? Maybe you breed dogs, and suddenly you've got all these dogs, and now the economic incentives are aligned in such a way that maybe you don't pay for every dog to get surgery for cancer or whatever it is that affects it, because now suddenly that dynamic, that relationship changes. So I think it depends, right? And I mean, what am I saying there, right? It's sort of like saying, hey, I believe that, you could have one slave in your family, and you could treat them well, but suddenly when you've got a plantation, now it's not okay, right? And that's fucked, right? Obviously, one slave is one too many, right? Um, so I can understand where the vegans are coming from. They're like, that line of logic doesn't work at all. But I think in practice, again, right? Uh, sure, we could talk in theory all day, but I think in practice is what matters the most, right? In practice, I think people do, treat their pets very well, to the degree that they can. And I think I do believe, again, that power imbalance can be overcome, right? So I'd love to hear what you think, because you might disagree. You might believe, hey, man, one slave is one too many, just like one pet is one too many, and you're never going to overcome that power imbalance within the species. So that, I mean, that's an argument, right? And that's what the vegans believe, and I understand that totally. But it's just not my belief, right? I believe that you could have a pet and treat it well, and maybe one day I will have a pet. We'll see, right? And likewise, I think you could have, chickens, and you can treat the chickens extremely well, and you can give them, whatever it is, the um, the health services and stuff like that, and you could treat them really well. So I think that's attainable. Okay, so that's sort of the first thing, which is sort of this idea about um, treating animals well, which is sort of the root of veganism. But the next thing about veganism is why. Why? What does it mean to hurt an animal, and where does the line come there? And I think what it really comes down to at the end of the day is suffering, because, well, here's a little story, right? Scientists have determined that plants can feel pain. Okay, we know now through science that some plants can detect if the very subtle sensations, right? There are some plants that can feel if a little fly lands on their leaf. They can feel that. They can register that pain. So why is it okay to kill these plants if they feel pain, when it's not okay to kill the animals, right? A lot of people will say that. Well, the reason why is because I mean, it's kind of simple. The plants, though they may feel pain, they're not suffering from the pain. And that's the difference, right? Just like you might feel if you clip off your fingernail, you don't feel pain if you clip off your fingernail, like you might if you clip off your finger, right? There's a difference there, okay, that I think everybody can appreciate. And so just because you can feel doesn't mean you can suffer. And that's really the line between the plants and the animals, is this idea that the plants aren't suffering when you cut them, where the cows that are getting their throats slaughtered, yeah, they can feel that. They can suffer. So there's a difference there, right? That's why people shouldn't eat animals, obviously, because they're dying, right? They're literally screaming in pain a lot of times. So that's not okay, right? But for plants, the plants don't scream in pain, not because they don't have mouths, but because they're not even suffering. They don't even register the pain, right? To the extent that science tells us. There are some animals that also don't register pain. And again, this is somewhat debated within the vegan community, but vegans will say, hey, it doesn't matter what kind of animal, you shouldn't kill them, right? Because they don't want to, I think, address the nuance there, because veganism ultimately, just like abolitionism, is an absolutist stance. It really is when it comes down to it, right? And so maybe the definition on Google or the Merriam-Webster's dictionary might have changed in recent years. It might say something like, oh, don't kill animals unless it's absolutely necessary. At the end of the day, veganism, the second you start killing animals, despite what necessary means, you're no longer doing vegan acts, right? It's not okay to kill an animal as a vegan, right? If you start killing animals and you're doing it, right, like, that's not a vegan act. I don't think the disaster situation applies. Just like, well, I mean, like, it'd be pretty ridiculous, right, to add a clause that says like, malice is when you do something evil unless it's necessary, right? It's sort of assumed that if you do an act of evil, it's malice. The necessary part is irrelevant, right? Just like murder is murder, Sure, you can add in these qualifiers to say, oh, that's not quite murder, that's manslaughter, right? But let's say, to kill someone is to kill someone regardless of the case, right? Malice is malice, and veganism is veganism, right? Regardless of whether or not it was necessary. That's what I believe. So I think that I lost my train of thought there. But ultimately, I think, yeah, I lost my train of thought. But what I was saying is that basically, veganism is ultimately this absolutist stance. So what they're saying is like, hey, it's never okay to kill these animals and to abuse them. Oh, right, I was talking about sentience, right? So it's this idea that, like, veganism basically believes that sort of, whenever there's pain or registered pain, then it's not okay. But my personal belief is that if the animal's not suffering, then I think it falls into the plant category. And are there organisms in the animal kingdom that don't suffer? Yes, there are. I know of at least one, which is bivalves, right? Which is basically, bivalves are a certain subset of, I don't know, it's either fish or like crustaceans, where basically these particular animals don't register pain, right? And again, some people might debate the science on that, but to the best of our knowledge, they don't feel pain. So that's why I'm okay with eating oysters, because, to the best of the science and our knowledge, oysters don't feel pain. And it is absolutely not vegan to eat an oyster, right? But people want to, people, like I was saying, like, there's sort of a zeitgeist now of like definition and subjective truth. And so there's been a lot of new terminology to sort of contextualize veganism to someone's subjective truth. So what people will say is they'll say, I'm not a vegan, I'm a segan. And what segan is basically, oh, I eat seafood, right? Or, oh, I eat the bivalves because they, because it's my own sort of subset of veganism. And I think that's a lot more honorable than somebody who just changes the definition of veganism to fit, their own lived experience, right? Somebody who, somebody who basically just says, "Oh, things are bad except for the bad things I do because those are acceptable." That person is living a little bit of a lie, right? I think we'd all say that, right? So if I'm to say I'm vegan, then that would be really a bit of a lie. However, I think there's also a bit of a convenience factor that shouldn't be overlooked. I think sometimes people say they are Catholic because it reflects a belief system that they grew up with, even if they and to some degrees it reflects their spirituality, when in truth they don't support the maybe political opinions and maybe even religious views of the Catholic Church. Now you might say, hey, why would you identify as Catholic if you don't support the Catholic Church? That's a little bit of an oxymoron, isn't it? Because Catholicism is literally defined by the Catholic Church. You can say you're Christian, you can even say you're spiritual, but why say you're Catholic if you're not following the edicts of Catholicism? And that's a fair point, right? But I think some people will just say, "Oh, I'm Catholic," because it's sort of like a shorthand, right? It's sort of saying, this group of beliefs with the saints and the doctrines and the spirituality and sort of all and the cultural significance, right? It's all sort of wrapped into one. And yeah, maybe I don't support this, really fucked up thing that the church does and supports, but I'm Catholic in for the most part. So that's why I'm going to say I'm Catholic, right? And so I think we can all understand where someone's coming from when they might say that. And I think because of that, um, I maybe there's also an argument to be made that like it's okay to say you're vegan. And that's why many times I'll say, "Oh, I'm vegan." But in truth, the vegan that I am is really like a subset, right? It's not. It's almost like it's not quite Catholic, right? It's sort of like um, if if Catholicism is a subset of Christianity, then I think veganism is a subset of living a righteous life. And I say I'm veganism because I think that more accurately reflects the value system that I hold than it would be to say I'm a righteous man. Because if I say I'm a righteous man, that's kind of oblivious. That's kind of ambiguous, isn't it? It doesn't really say very much at all. So that's why I might say I'm veganism, even if I don't hold the political opinions of, you know, the capital V vegan movement. And, obviously labels are a little bit dangerous, right? Because what are you going to do if you say, hey, I'm a Catholic, and then suddenly the Catholics declare jihad on, the Muslim Empire in a crusade? Then you've got a bit of a conflict there, right? And so I think that's why some people might distance themselves from the capital C church if certain things happen, right? If like the church says something that's like fucked up, they're gonna do some distancing there. Similarly, I think that's why I'm making this video, because I think I don't 100% politically align with the capital V vegan movement, and this video is basically meant to uh, outline my divergence from the ideology. Okay, so we talked a little bit about having pets. We talked a little bit about pain and suffering and sort of where the line is there. Is there anything else? Oh, here's another. Okay, and then here's the last thing, which is just like vegans who eat seafood will sometimes call themselves a segan, which is a sort of an attempt to uh, describe a sect of veganism, which is to say, a sort of section of the political beliefs, right, that might diverge from the capital V vegan movement. There's another divergence called the freegans. And what freegans believe is that if food is going to be thrown out, and specifically by food, I mean carcasses, if an animal that is dead and has been harvested, slaughtered, let's say, it's going to have if the body's going to decompose, right, or going to be thrown out, then Freegans say, don't let the body go to waste, man. I'll eat the body. So that's what Freegans believe. And I am also a part of that belief system. So again, I think this has to do a lot with the in practice implications of being a vegan in our society, right? So in an ideal world, nobody's killing animals. So, and I'm not killing animals. So I have no access to dead animals. So I'm not eating dead animals. But in my lived experience, there are dead animals at every food place I go to. In my own household, my girlfriend, I love her, right, to death, right? But she eats animals, right? She regularly orders animals to be killed for her, right? And she also sometimes doesn't have a full appetite for her food, and so she'll throw out a burrito or some shit, right? And this animal that has died is now going to be thrown away, right? And in those cases, I will eat the animal, right? I will eat the flesh of another living being that has been harvested, right? And like, does that sound incredibly fucked up? Yeah, because it is, right? But I think there are other factors at play here. And so I think in practice, it probably makes more sense for me to eat that animal because it's died, right? And it's the food is going to be wasted. And when I think about veganism isn't veganism in a vacuum, right? It's in relation to so many other things and environmental factors as well. And I think for me personally, when I consider food waste and I consider the amount of food that is going to be thrown away or in leftovers and all that stuff, especially growing up in my family household where we have a household of 6 people, so and none of them are vegan except for me, right? So it's like in that environment where the food's getting thrown away all the time, I think, what am I doing? Why am I not eating this animal, right? Because I guess my real um my real issue isn't eating the flesh of the animal. It's the suffering, as I alluded to before, right? So if in theory, I mean, obviously this sounds ridiculous, right? Because it's another one of those things where in practice this would never happen, right? But in theory, if an animal that died and wasn't going to feel any pain now would either have its body thrown away, or it could be used to feed another human being, or to feed, not another human being. That's cannibalism. That's a different story, right? But if it could be used to feed a human, right? Let's say an animal dies or whatever, then I think that's okay, right? I guess that also means I think it's okay to eat like a dog if it dies, and honestly, I think it probably is. That sounds kind of insane and kind of ridiculous and kind of crazy, and it is, right? I mean, obviously, well, I don't want to say it's crazy. Like, okay, well, I want to address the elephant in the room, which is that there's a lot of cultures where they do eat dogs and cats, and usually it's not because they want to. Usually it's because of extreme poverty. But and I don't want to say, oh, those societies are crazy, because that's a little bit well, that's a little bit like maybe like prejudice of me. But I think in practice, it's like a lot of these people don't want to eat these animals, and so they're only eating it to survive. And I think that's where a certain degree of like the moral implications come in as well, and I think that's always a factor, right? So I think in American society, it's not okay to eat your dog, right? And I think that's a good law, but I think so I wouldn't eat a dog, right? But I would never even eat a dog, right? But I think I would eat a cow if it was going to be otherwise thrown away. And I think that's why, because for me the food waste element comes into play, and I think, why am I going to contribute to that issue when there's no suffering that I'm going to cause, basically? So what's the difference there? Well, basically, I think if I'm ordering food and I'm paying for the food, then it's I'm paying for the food So if I didn't order this food, I'm not creating demand in the market, right? And some people will say, oh, what difference does it make if I buy a burger? Am I really going to make an impact on the meat industry, whether or not one person buys a burger? Well, one person probably not, right? But as we've seen recently with the meat industry, it's made a huge difference. There's a huge amount of people in our country in particular, but around the globe in general, who are eating less and less red meat as it's becoming extremely apparent that not only is it fucked up and not morally righteous, but it's also not good for your health to eat red meat. And so the meat industry is in a really tough place right now, and they're getting, a lot of government subsidies, unfortunately, and stuff like that in order to keep them afloat. But the truth is that less and less people, Americans in particular, are eating red meat with each passing decade. So it does have an impact. It really does. You can make a difference by not only stop eating meat, but as the philosopher Jordan Peterson always says, like, you have a network effect. If you do something and you influence your friends to do something, then you can change the world in a very way that sort of stacks the top of each other, right? Just like if you see something horrible happen to someone and you don't say anything, then well, as the famous quote says, in an act of oppression, if you don't say anything, then you're implicitly siding on the side of the oppressor, right? I think that's true, right? And so that's sort of like when the good people do nothing, as they say. The bad things happen a little bit more and a little bit more, right? And I think it's just the opposite effect, where like if you take a stance, then people in your social circle are going to see that, and they're going to say, "Hey, this man, he's trying to be a righteous man in life, and I want to be a righteous man too." And I think that's sort of how societies form around these fundamental uh, good beliefs. I think you have to do good things, and you have to some degree proselytize what it means to be a good person, and you need to go out there, right? I think you need to go out there and you need to say, "Hey, man, it's not okay to have slaves. I don't have slaves, and I don't want any of my friends to have slaves." And I think that's what abolitionism means. And I think veganism means the same thing. It means, hey, I'm not going to eat food. I'm not going to eat these animals, and I'm not going to create that demand in the marketplace. And I don't, and I'm going to tell my friends, hey, that's kind of fucked up. That paid for that animal to be killed for you. I think that's kind of what that means to take a stance in today's world, right? The same way you don't abuse your animal, and you say, hey, man, animal abuse is not okay, right? It's the same thing, right? Animal abuse is always the example that vegan people will use, because I think animal abuse is, well, I mean, it's a lot easier to compare to animals being killed because they're animals in both cases, right? Whereas I think slavery is less used as an analog for veganism, because in truth, killing a human is not the same as killing an animal. Speciesism aside, it's just not the same. A human is not an animal, right? It's just a different thing, and humans play a different role in our society, speciesism aside. So it's not really a direct parallel, but I think when we look at the legislature for human atrocity, there's a lot more legislation for human atrocity than there is for animal atrocity, because well, I think humans have sort of, woken up to the idea that it's not okay to have slaves. And I think in the next 100 years, more and more people are going to realize, oh shit, maybe it's also not okay to have slaves in any circumstance, because, the American justice system is not treating their slaves very well. And as long as the American justice system continues to have slaves, and huge companies like all these companies that have slaves, like which is to say, any company that uses slave labor, and there's a lot of companies that use slave labor today, right? And those companies are companies like, I believe, T-Mobile allows for their call centers to be manned by people who are enslaved through the American justice system, who are basically, they're forced to do labor, as part of their punishment. They have to do the T-Mobile call center, right? That's fucked up, right? Don't use T-Mobile, right? There's other companies that will use uh, the people who are currently enslaved in the American justice system to do manual labor, right? Like, for example, some product assembly is done by people who have to work as part of their punishment in the American justice system. Slave labor, right? As long as that continues, I think there's going to be injustice in this world, and I think soon, maybe soon on a scale of decades, if not centuries, then society will wake up to that. And I think in the future people are going to see animals and they're going to see the same thing. They're going to say, hey, this is not okay. So in summary, why am I not vegan? I'm not vegan because the first thing, I think that the power imbalance between a pet and its owner can be overcome. I think that people can treat their pets as well as they treat their siblings, their brothers, their sisters, their husbands, their wives. I do believe that. And I've seen it in my life. I've seen a lot of people treat animals with the highest amount of respect, socially and financially, right? I think that's the case. Okay, and that's just my opinion, right? There's some people who think a pet having a pet is never going to be okay, and I respect that opinion. I totally understand where they're coming from. Then the second thing is I believe that so why am I not veganism? Because I believe that that difference can be overcome. The second reason is because I believe that some animals who do not feel suffering yet may still feel pain, I think it's okay to eat them. I don't think there's a moral qualm I have about killing an animal that's not going to suffer. If I harvest an oyster, which is to say, if I slaughter an oyster and I eat it and it doesn't register the pain as suffering, then I think that's okay. I don't have a moral qualm with doing that. So that's the second reason. What's the third reason? The third reason is because so the first one was overcoming the power imbalance. The second one was the suffering. And the third reason was the waste, right? The food waste. The third reason why I'm not a vegan is because I believe that if an animal carcass is going to be thrown out, then I don't have a moral qualm with consuming the carcass. Because I think if it's going to be thrown out anyway, then I'm not creating demand in the ecosystem. And I'm also not and I just I don't know. I guess I just don't have a moral qualm with that. Uh, and I guess I totally understand why people are going to have a different opinion. They're going to say, "Hey, man, don't eat a burger if it's going to be thrown away. Always eat a veggie burger and let that waste pile up because you've got to do what's right." And the moral the moral injustice of eating flesh is worse than maybe the environmental injustice of contributing to waste. And I can see why people feel that way, right? I mean, it's not like environmental injustice is not a big issue, because it is. It's a huge issue. So those are the three reasons: the power imbalance, the suffering, and the waste. And I think all those reasons, yeah, I think every single one of those reasons is founded in practice. Because in theory, I don't think really any of these reasons come into play. But I think I guess it's been over a year, yeah, probably over a year that I've been vegan. I found that all those factors contribute to me not adopting the core ideologies of what it means to be veganism, of what it means to be a vegan. So, all of that said, do I identify as a vegan? Sometimes. And that's basically just because, like I said before, it's like the church in the identification of like the ideology, the practice, but not necessarily a subscription to everything the church does, right? I think it's the same way there. And because I also think that we shouldn't I think we shouldn't dilute the definition, right? I should say I'm vegan, but here's where I disagree. And I think that's more important than me just saying like, I'm vegan and I'm gonna change the definition to fit myself. So I think if I say that I'm vegan, I should always probably clarify that there's some catches, which is why I think it's probably best for me to say I'm a segan or I'm a freegan or something like that. Though, of course, most people don't know what those terms mean. And so for the sake of convenience, I might just say I'm a vegan. Like some people might say they're a Christian, even if they don't support all views of Christianity. So that's why I might sometimes say I'm a vegan. But I guess I am to some degree diluting the definition if I do that. So I have to be aware of that as well, because I think it's my responsibility to not dilute the definition, because I think there's a lot of value for veganism to remain the absolutist ideology that it is. Okay, so is that it? So that's why I am not really a vegan. And I think saying you're plant-based is kind of a cop-out, because I think that's sort of like saying, well, that's sort of like saying, I'm okay with acts of violence sometimes. Right? And I mean, I think in reality, most people are, but I guess it's sort of like saying, I'm okay with acts of malice sometimes. And I don't think acts of malice really are ever okay, right? So that's every political opinion I could probably fit into an hour. That's how I feel about that. I felt like I should write it down at some point. And maybe at some point I could write an essay or something that can further that can reduce the amount of words in my thesis here, because that took too long, obviously. And thank you if you're still here. But hey, man, at the end of the day, I want to know what you think. I would really appreciate if you left me a comment. Certainly, if you made it this far in the video. Holy shit! Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to me ramble. What do you think about veganism and freeganism and seganism? Do you think anything less than the absolutist views of veganism is sacrilege? Or do you think that the vegans are just a little bit too absolute? I'd love to know what you think. Um, there's a lot of nuance to it. I mean, right? Because I could talk about this forever. I really could. It's something I feel very passionately about. I care about this stuff so much. There's so much injustice in the world, and I think we've really got to take a hard look at our own lived experiences in order to antagonize what role we play in that injustice and what role we are empowered to play in saving the world, because it's our obligation. It's our moral duty. All right, that's all I got to say.